And it's a star tetrahedron inscribed in a sphere. One of the most important images that you can ever imagine. And yet we're only beginning to touch on what this really means. I mean, it's not just all life that we know. It's even more than that, as you'll see in a little bit. And so, and then to describe the rest of it very quickly, it moves from there. Well, it actually, this is also a cube. You'd never know it by looking at that. But if you were to connect the centers of all those together, the star tetrahedron forms a perfect cube also. So the star tetrahedron fits inside another Platonic solid called a cube, and it's connected to it. It's the diagonal lines across the cube that form the relationships of this pattern. And just to give you an idea of how intelligent God is, how amazing the Creator is. This here, go back to this other one. Even though this is a star tetrahedron, you're now looking at it from the top, looking down. There is this place where it becomes a cube, and if you were to look at just these four here, there's these other four behind it. So if you were looking from over here at this face, you'd only see these four, and you wouldn't see the four behind it because they would be slightly smaller. And you would get this image here. You'd see these four spheres right here, and you couldn't see the four behind it because they're slightly smaller. And it fits inside of, like we already showed, a perfect cube right here. And that's a cube if it was going back through there like that. And this circle here will exactly enclose those 8 cells. And this other one outside of it is the thickness of the membrane, which is called the zona pellucida of the mitosis at 8-cell division. That is actually determined by the flower of life, with those 2 lines that are on the outside, has actually determined the thickness of the membrane. Even the thickness of the membrane is not an accident. It's not just a random thing. It's all based on sacred geometry. And here you can see the star tetrahedron also inscribed in the sphere at the same time. And we'll explain that in just a moment. And so here Leonardo is actually showing how this relationship of the corners, the width of the circles, and all the relationship of this male form that's in here. But if you think about this for a moment, it's because here is the 8-cell division, and it is in the exact proportions of the real thing. But it also, so that's at one time you were in that shape of 8 cells with this cube around it and the sphere that contained it. And even at the moment of 8 cells, it contains the exact proportions of the adult human body. It's amazing, really. So we just touched upon how sacred geometry works on microscopic levels. What about the macrocosm instead of the microcosm? Let's look up into the macrocosm of the stars and the planets and these kinds of things. There was a man named Kepler, and I can't remember when he lived. I think it was 200 or 300 years ago, but I don't actually remember when he lived. But you can look it up. And he believed that the positioning of the orbits of our planets in our solar system were not at random, that from everything that he had studied, that they had to be directly connected to the 5 Platonic solids. And he searched for it, and he made all these models, and he went through a lot of his life trying to find this, and it wasn't accurate, and it didn't work. The reason it didn't work is because his information was inaccurate. They didn't know where the planets were in orbits. And so he was working with inaccurate information. But there are people now, today, who have put this into computers, where they have taken all of sacred geometry that's known and all what NASA knows about where the planets are located relative to the sun. And they know the precise maximum, minimum, and mean orbit of each one of these different planets very precisely. And that was all thrown into the equation. And then a button was pushed to find out what the computer could find, and what they found proved conclusively that it's true. That all of the planets, their orbits, their relationships to each other, you can pick Mars to Earth or Mars to Jupiter, and those relationships are not only are all of them in relationship to the sun, but to each other they are in relationship. And even the sizes of them are not at random. Planets can only be at certain sizes. Sounds outrageous? Well, let's look at this next slide. And we'll come, oh, not that next slide. I forgot about that one. And I forgot about that one. This one. Again, we have Leonardo's drawing. And first thing I want you to notice is that if you take this body that he's got drawing here with his arms out like that and his legs straight down, so you're like this, there's a perfect square that fits around your body. In other words, you are the height. Now, if you take an individual, that won't be true. There'll be variances. But science has taken large groups. You have to have a minimum of 100 people, and they've measured them really carefully. And they found that the height of the body and the width of the body, there's a difference of only 1/10,000th of an inch. You can barely see 1/10,000th of an inch. And that 1/10,000th of an inch isn't a mistake. It's related to the Fibonacci sequence, which is another subject. I can't tell you about that, but it is not a mistake. It's part of the equation. And so basically, you are the same height as you are with your arms out. And a cube passes, or a square or a cube passes around there, and the center of that square is precisely at the perineum, the body. Then, if you put your arms like this and your legs out like that, there's a circle that will pass perfectly around there, or a sphere. And it's this one here, which isn't drawn very well. It kind of disappears there. It comes right underneath the feet and goes on around. Comes up here. Comes on down around and comes back down under the feet. And the center of that one is exactly at the navel. And so you have this circle and this square relationship around the human body. Every biological form has different, it chooses different geometrical patterns to structure itself through. And so you have to figure out which one it is, but the human body is the square, the circle. And if you then move this circle that's at the navel, and you just bring the whole thing down to the same center as the square, then you get the circle here. And you see how it cuts that corner, just that little bit right there, and it cuts it right there, and right there, and right there. And interesting enough, if you were to measure this square that fits around the body there, the perimeter of that, and then you were to measure the circumference of that, if you have a perfectly formed body, they're the same. And it's been determined, and if you study, you'll see, that when the square and the circle, in China they talk about squaring the circle and circling the square, when the perimeter of the square and the circumference of the circle are the same, that's when human consciousness focuses in, and that's when life begins. And now one step further, if you were this square that goes around the human body, if you put a circle inside of that square, which is this blue in here, and then up here at this circle, you were to come down here and draw a circle around with this to here being your measuring stick, you get this little orange one up here. Guess what? This, relative to this, is exactly mathematically proportionate to the size of the Earth to the size of the Moon. This was determined at least 2,000 years ago. What does it mean? I mean, you know, what does it mean that in the proportions of the human body, the very planet that we're standing on and the moon that circles around it is in there, in the very proportions, predetermined? Is it just a coincidence or an accident? I don't think so. In fact, we know for sure because of what I'm about to show you in a minute. I just mentioned about Kepler and him extending this idea out to, because he knew about this idea also. He knew that the Earth and the Moon were in proportion. That's why he believed that everything had to be in the solar system. I believe it's absolutely everything to the most distant galaxy and the sizes of every galaxy, etc., and everything. But we can prove it in our own solar system. There's a book written. The guy took all of the relationships that the computer found and put them into a book. It's about, I don't know, an inch thick, and it's a couple hundred different possible relationships that you could ever think of. You know, like we're going to show one Chiron and I think Mars. I can't remember. I'll have to wait till I get on there. I just chose 3 of them. But there are about 200 of them that they've picked out, and it's called the Book of Coincidences. And so we were going to, I had got it all together, I got the money together and everything else, and we were going to make a movie about this, a documentary, to show how this was, because this man figured it out. He came over here and then realized, oh my gosh, I'm going to be famous. And he didn't want to be famous, and so he wouldn't allow the movie, and he won't allow anyone to even use his name. So I can't tell you who did it, so I guess it doesn't really matter. But there's only 1,000 copies of the book in the world. And this is one of the pages. I forgot this one too. I just did this last night for the first time. One more thing I got to show you first. If you take the edge of the Earth over to the edge of the Earth, the diameter of the Earth, and from the center of the Earth to the center of the Moon, and then you draw these lines right here, this angle right here is 51 degrees, 51 minutes, 24 seconds, and which happens to be the exact angle and precise proportions of the Great Pyramid. This is interesting because Hermes, who most people who've studied this believe was also a man named Thoth, in the Emerald Tablets that was written by Hermes, he states how the Great Pyramid was built from the proportions of the Earth. Well, whether or not Thoth or Hermes actually built the Great Pyramid, we can't prove that, but we can prove that what he has just said inside that statement is fact. That angle right there is 51 degrees, 51 minutes, 24 seconds. And so this is a precise arrangement of what we just talked about. Now I can go to this other thing that we're going to talk about. This is one of his pages out of this book, and it's the relationship between Chiron and Pluto. And in other words, this is the orbit of these two bodies. This is Pluto here. And these are a very simple relationship. All you have to do is and the sun is in the center. All you have to do is draw a 5-sided pentagon, and then you draw one down facing the other way, then you draw one up, and then you draw one down, and you draw one up, and on the inner one you draw a circle, and on the outer one you draw a circle, and those lines go up and form the exact relationship between the Sun, Chiron, and Pluto. It's 99.8% perfect, considering we have a moving system through space and time. Everything's moving through there. They're not only going around this way, but the whole thing is moving like this, as as a solid body moving around the galaxy connected to the star Sirius. It's pretty amazing that a simple drawing like this could do that. But when you start looking at first 1, then 2, then 50, then 100, then 150, these relationships, and they're all that way. Anything you can think of, any relationship between, say, the Earth and Mars and the Earth and Venus or Earth and Mercury or anything like that, it's already been worked out. They're all there, every single doggone one of them. This is another simple one here. This is the relationship of Earth to Mars. Earth and Mars. Really simple. Just draw a 5-pointed star down and 1 pointed up. The inner circle goes up and is the orbit of Mars relative to the Sun. The outer one, of the Earth. And the outer one becomes the orbit of Mars. And it also is 99.8% perfect. They're all 99.8 or 99.9. I think there's one that's 99.7. The fact that that could happen is not a coincidence, even though it's called a book of coincidences. Everything. And so, what this is saying is that everything's predetermined. And that's what sacred geometry shows clearly. That there's only certain places where things can happen. And you can see where they're going to be by the geometrical proportions of things. It's possible for the human mind to understand the entire universe on a physical level. You could grok the whole thing with just a little bit of study. And that does this funny thing to the left and the right side of your brain. It's the beginning. It's not the end. It's not what it's all about. It's only the first step. Now, this one's a really interesting one. I chose it for this reason. All over the ancient world, they built temples to try to determine basically the tropic of Cancer and the tropic of Capricorn, the maximum winter dropping of the sun to the maximum, you have the summer, what is that? It's the winter, spring, the difference in those, it's winter, spring, I think. But it's when the sun swings one way down and swings down the other way, and you try to determine those points. You need to know the equinoxes so you can do your planting and all these things like this. They could have simply drawn this drawing in the sand, one pentagon down, one up, one down, one up. It's just 4 of them. One was 5, one was 2, and one was 4. And drawn the circles inside there like that, drew them down into a ring, and if you could put them over a sphere, those rings, as they fit over a sphere, precisely locate the Tropic of Cancer, the equator, and the Tropic of Capricorn. That is 100% perfect. It is absolutely right on. Now, this whole thing about a star tetrahedron inscribed in a sphere has come about it in a slightly different way. We were showing how it is the basis of all biological life forms, and how in the microcosm, and how the relationships of the 5 platonic solids are out in space around us. This is a crop circle, and it was one that Richard Hoagland was analyzing. I became, at one point, Richard Hoagland was the person who found, using NASA photographs, the face on Mars. Now, that face on Mars has been discredited by NASA like crazy, but if you knew the truth of why they were doing that, you'd understand. They don't want you to look at Mars because there's too much going on there right now. And they really got angry at him for even bringing our attention to the planet at all, and they really tried to blow him out of the water. But he proved beyond a doubt what he was talking about. But still, they're not going to agree with him on any level, even though it's what he talked about is fact. But there, around the face on Mars, were many other actual pyramids. Lots of them, 3-, 4-, and 5-sided pyramids. And there's I don't know how many there are, but there's about 25 or 30 of them out there on the desert. One of them is called the D and M pyramid, and that pyramid is extraordinary if by its mere size. It's a 5-sided pyramid, but it's 10 miles high, 50,000 feet plus high. And when they laid out all that pattern over the whole thing and all the relationships of pyramids, and they drew all the lines between them, all the sacred proportions and all the many of the sacred geometrical relationships became apparent. But when they analyzed the D&M pyramid and in relationship to everything, it came up with this funny shape that they didn't understand. It kept talking very powerfully about a star tetrahedron inscribed in a sphere. And so he didn't know what the heck it meant. All he knew was whoever was on there and who, at some time, whoever lived there, was definitely trying to say how important the star tetrahedron inscribed in a sphere was. So he found out I was doing this work, and he called me, and we started talking about it. And I told him what it was. And I told him that it not only is it the basis of all life and everything and all structure and everything else like that, but it's also actually exists around the human body three-dimensionally in an electromagnetic field that sits at about 4 degrees Kelvin. That's about 4 degrees above absolute zero. And that you can actually put it on a computer screen and see it if you have the right instruments and everything. And that very intricate pattern, which is inside of the, which is in the book, which we don't have it all in the book, but most of it, it also is inside of all the planets, and it's also inside the sun, exactly the same, and the galaxy, etc. And it's also around atoms and everything else. It's around everything. It's always the same. Even if it's a little daisy growing out in the field, the patterns around it are the same. They're just smaller. They're in proportion to it. And so he started thinking about all of that. And when he got to this particular crop circle, one of the mathematicians that was working for him, this is that crop circle drawn very, very precisely, they found these particular angles, etc. And when at first look at this thing, you go, what does it mean? It doesn't mean a darn thing to me. Well, he has very high-powered mathematicians that work with NASA and work also with him that spend a lot of time with their computers trying to figure out what this meant. And they all got done. They said, gee, I don't understand it, but what it's describing is a three-dimensional star tetrahedron inscribed in a sphere. And he goes, no. And this began an even deeper looking into what this was all about. Well, here's the same drawing we've seen a little while ago. And around the human body is the star tetrahedron inscribed in a sphere, exactly in these proportions. The distance from the top of the head to that point is exactly 1 hand length. And the distance between the feet and the bottom down there is exactly 1 hand length, your hand length. You're your own measuring stick. And there is a tube that runs from that point all the way through the body, entering in at the perineum, running all the way through, coming out the top of the head, which the Hindus call the crown chakra, and goes up to this one here, where there's another chakra. All the chakras inside the human body that are in the spinal column aspect of it are inside of this tube. We've been able to scientifically document that. And there's not 7 of them, but there's 12 of them. And from the base of the spine to the top of the head, there's exactly 12, and that's the 13th one. Again, those 13 circles that all this began from. This is not outrageous, considering that that's how it all started. When you were a little tiny 8-cell division, you were a star tetrahedron inscribed in a sphere. And you have a sphere of energy around your body that's actually there. It's electromagnetic in nature, and this pattern is really there. And this tube is really there. The Tibetans have known this for a long time. They were the only people left in the world that I'm aware of that truly understand what this is and what it's related to. Under certain conditions, if you breathe in a certain way, and you do something with your mind, and you do something with, actually you're doing something, originally I thought it was the mind and the heart, but I've got that real clear in my mind now. It's really just, you do something with your left brain and you do something with your right brain, which has to do with your emotional body, and you spin these things. This one can spin like on an axis. The entire thing, there's not one of them there, but there's three that are exactly the same, and one set can move one way and